Thank you, Ty. Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. I will answer the first three questions, 6'7". Yes, I did. Back when players were very skinny and the shorts were very short. And how did I get to become a futurist? Well, I was a college student at a little college in Spokane, Washington, when that particular college hired a new president whose name was Dr. Ed Lindemann. Ed Lindemann came to the college direct from the Apollo spacecraft program, where he was director of program planning for Apollo. And he taught a particular way of thinking about the future, which I will in part share with you this morning. Still an inspiration to me. He's been gone for quite a long time now. And there are avenues to become a professional futurist. The most well-known one, interestingly enough, is right here in Houston at the University of Houston. It's a Futurist Studies program right here. But I came to it through this more indirect route. In the early part of my life, I was a college professor and began to do some consulting on the side. And then about a couple of decades ago, began working full-time as a futurist. Fortunate enough to have registered Futurist.com back in the day. There's a story attached to that. So for about 2 decades now, I've been working with enterprises of all kinds, both private and public, large manufacturing, to energy, to software, to healthcare. And I get the same invitation, generally speaking, over and over again. The invitation sounds something like this. We routinely look at the future on a fairly short-term horizon when we do strategic planning. Let's say 3 to 5 years, which is really quite typical, as we all know. This time, we'd like to look further into the future than we usually do. Now, that might be just simply through a presentation, but it might also be through a more intensive kind of process, a strategic planning or a long-range planning process, if you will, that might involve developing some scenarios or looking a couple of decades ahead. The most interesting one that I was thinking about as we were watching the introductory material about life cycles was a foundation that asked me, along with many others, to come together to ask this question: what will it take for humanity to survive for 1,000 years? It was the only 1,000-year view futuring project that I've ever worked on. That was really quite interesting. So here we are to think about the future of organizations, and in particular the kinds of organizations that you're in a world which we all know now has become very software-centric and becomes increasingly software-centric as we go forward, where most of what we do, most of what we imagine doing, and particularly most of what we imagine doing if we're going to be more resilient and if we're going to be more successful in the future, involves a better application of better software than anything that's existed before. We've been here before in times of change. We clearly live in a time of significant change. We've been here before. I appreciated Ty's introduction with the correct pronunciation of my last name, Hiemstra, which is the very Dutch pronunciation. I'm going to tell you a quick story about my paternal grandparents. I did come, my parents on both sides, grandparents on both sides of my family came from the Netherlands. My father, grandfather, the one named Hiemstra, came from a province in Holland called Friesland, and he came about 105 years ago to the United States, about 1910. He was very young, had a very young bride. They decided to homestead in Montana. He had grown up as a child in the 1890s, dreaming of coming to the United States, and in particular of coming to the western United States. And so he came to Montana, where he attempted to be, along with his family and a number of other Dutch settlers in this particular area, to be dryland wheat farmers. It turned out to be a pretty tough time to be dryland wheat farmers. There was a lot of drought going on. The land was very rocky. It was not as nice as they had been led to believe. But they stuck it out for about 15 years until one last hailstorm wiped out one last wheat crop. And my grandfather loaded the family, which now consisted of 5 children, into a truck which they now owned. And they headed for Pendleton, Oregon, where they knew the wheat farming would be better. But the truck broke down in Nampa, Idaho. And they couldn't get it fixed on the weekend. They attended a church, being church-going people. And the people there said, there's no need to go on to Oregon, just stay right here in Idaho, which is how I came to be born in Nampa then some years later. What's interesting about that time period let's say the years about 1900 to about 1925 or 1930, is how comparable they are to today. I never asked my grandparents this question, but I suppose that they looked back sometime in the late 1920s as they sat across the kitchen table late one night and looked at each other and said, you know, it's unbelievable how different our lives are now compared to when we were growing up as little children back in Holland in the 1890s. What had happened in about a 25-year time period? Well, x-rays were discovered, the radio was invented, the cause of malaria was discovered, the advent of electricity, which had of course been known about, became very common, the electrification of the country. The internal combustion engine and the whole takeoff into the whole industry that you're all so familiar with really happened in that 25-year time period. People moved off the farms into cities and towns, and really the beginnings of suburbs. And the Wright brothers flew an airplane, and World War I happened. And there was a lot of political change in the world, and it all happened in about a 25-year time period. It's really an unbelievable amount of change. And the good news is that they did just fine. Things got better, some things got worse, and they did just fine through all of that. I think, and I've said this for some time, that we're reliving the lifetime of my grandparents. It might be yours, it might be your great-grandparents. If you look at the years, let's say the 1990s and certainly around 2000 out to the year, let's say 2025 or 2030, when we look back from the perspective of 2025 or 2030, I think we'll see something quite similar. So I work with organizations that are trying to get a handle on this kind of world of change. And I work with them when they want to do this longer range than normal planning. And what I've discovered in doing that is at the end of the day, most planning turns out, even when we're trying to do better than this, turns out to be a search for a more efficient past, rather than a search for a truly new future. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. This came out just last week, a week ago Monday, from the Morgan Stanley company, Adam Jonas writing this particular report, about the future of one of the primary end users of the kinds of products that you're interested in, that is automobiles and vehicles that drive. And what Adam Jonas wrote is this: as we have written for some time, we expect all car companies would eventually see nearly 100% of their revenues shift from the sale of human-driven, individually owned cars to robot-driven, shared cars. And they produced this four-quadrant chart that you see on the screen.